Almighty God, creator of the universe, giver of life, who has ordained that we should live as social beings, seeking the fulfilment of our own true purpose within our society. Bless this Legislative Council now assembled to deliberate upon the affairs affecting the well-being and good order of society in Western Australia. That all members give honour, wisdom and integrity to the role for which they have been chosen, and the decisions and decorum of this Council be always to the advancement of thy glory, the honour of Her Majesty and the continued benefit of the people of this state. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory for ever and ever. Amen. Members, are there any petitions? The Honourable Robin Chappell.
Madam President, I present a petition containing 85 signatures couched in the following terms. To the Honourable President and members of the Legislative Council of Parliament in Western Australia, of Parliament of Western Australia in Parliament assembled, we, the undersigned, draw the attention of the members to the unlawful death of Elijah Doherty, an innocent 14-year-old Aboriginal juvenile in Kalgoorlie in August 2016. The man, who was subsequently charged by the police over his death, was convicted and sentenced to a maximum period of 3 years imprisonment, and that this sentence is inadequate and not consistent with the expectations or the standards of the community. Now, we, the undersigned, ask that the West Australian Government causes an urgent appeal to be lodged against that sentence and demand that the court impose a much more severe penalty that properly reflects the seriousness of the crime and is truly consistent with the expectations of the community. And your petitioners, as in duty bound, will ever pray.
Are there any further petitions? Are there any statements by ministers and parliamentary secretaries? Papers for tabling. Members, I have 2 papers for tabling. The Auditor-General's papers, Financial Controls Focus Area Audits 2016-2017, Report number 20, November 2017, and Audit Results Report Annual 2016-2017, Financial Audits Report number 21, November 2017. Leader of the House.
President, I have the following papers for tabling. Regulations, Education and Care Services National Law WA Act 2012. Schemes, Professional Standards Act 1997.
Minister for the Environment.
Thanks, Madam President. I have the following papers for tabling. Orders made under the Planning and Development Act 2005, Section 67(5), and regulations made under the Road Traffic Act 1974 and Road Traffic Code Amendment Regulations number 6, 2017.
Minister for Regional Development.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the following papers for tabling: Fair Trading Act 2010, Consumer Goods Baby Bath Aids Safety Standards, and Consumer Goods Sunglasses and Fashion Spectacles Safety Standards 2017.
The Honourable Robin Chappell.
Madam President, I am directed to present a report number 5 of the Joint Standing Committee on Delegated Legislation, Legal Professional Law Library Fees, Rules 2017.
That report's tabled. Would you like to make a statement?
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the report that I have just tabled advises the House of the outcome of the Committee's consideration of the Legal Professional Law Library Fees, Rules 2017. This instrument imposes 11 categories of fees for certain services offered at the new Law Library situated at the David Malcolm Justice Centre. The services include photocopying, printing, document delivery and interlibrary loans. The committee was provided with the rationale, including cost recovery information, for only 5 of the 11 fee categories. This is despite the requirements of the Premier's Circular 2014-01, entitled Subsidiary Legislation Explanatory Memoranda, and 2 formal requests for the information. The time constraints associated with a disallowance motion in this House prevented the committee from pursuing further information about the remaining 6 fees categories. These 6 fees, for which the committee has no rationale, all relate to the Law Library's documentary delivery service. without vital information for these six fees, the committee was unable to determine whether the fees are authorised by their empowering provisions. The committee found that because the government's provisions of inadequate information, it was unable to perform its scrutiny function on behalf of the Parliament in relation to Rules 6(1)(a), b, 6(2), 6(3), 6(4) and 6(5) of the instrument. Accordingly, the committee was also unable to make any recommendations with respect to the disallowance of the relevant rules of the instrument. I commend the report to the House.
Are there any further papers for tabling? Are there any notices of questions? Are there any notices of motions to introduce bills? Are there any notices of motions for disallowance? Are there any notices of motions? Are there any motions without notice? I'll just give the call to the Honourable Alana McTiernan.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to provide a personal explanation. I acknowledge
Minister,
sorry,
you're
I seek
seeking leave.
Thank
The Minister's seeking leave to make a personal statement. Is leave granted? Leave's granted. The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Madam President. I acknowledge I have made errors in comments during a debate in this place last Thursday. I now realise that donors to candidates in local government elections are required to disclose their donations where those donations exceed $200. I also acknowledge that the Honourable Martin Aldrich has received a statutory declaration from a complainant on a matter relating to the Greater Geraldton local government election. I apologise to that person for suggesting that person was a member of the National Party.
Okay. Members, we now move to orders of the day. Leader of the House.
Madam President, I move without notice that order of the day numbers 1 to 16 be taken after order of the day number 36.
Question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Members, we now move to order of the day number 17, Estimates of Review and Expenditure Consolidated Accounts Estimates 2017-2018. The question is that the budget papers be noted, and it's a continuation of the remarks of the Honourable Charles Smith.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, if I may just reiterate briefly, because I know members are keen to refresh their memories from last Thursday, especially your honourable member, Simon O'Brien. What I was saying is I wanted to acknowledge the state of the truly dreadful set of books the Labor Party inherited from the previous government. And I was saying it beggars belief that we are in this financial situation at all. We underwent a huge economic expansion, a once-in-a-century economic expansion, and all we have to show for that is a mountain of debt and a whole lot of economic pain. Now, I'll just quote from some budget propaganda that the government released, and I quote, "Everyone will need to share the burden to help get Western Australia back on track, and the state government is committed to minimising the impact on struggling families and small businesses." Now, it seems odd then that the state government chose to target certain sectors while shielding others. Surely the burden should be spread across all sectors in our economy. Why then are some LNG producers, banks who make mega profits, why were they not asked to make a contribution but the gold mining sector was? This seems patently unfair to me. As we've previously heard on now many occasions, the profit margins across the gold sector are simply not strong enough to absorb a significant royalty increase. As my honourable colleague Robin Scott has continuously said, a substantial increase in the gold royalty would have turned that beautiful town, Kalgoorlie-Boulder, in the heart of the goldfields into the centre for the dolefields. We stand with the people of the goldfields, and that's why we decided to vote against the gold royalty rate increase. Sorry, member? So we hear. Now, we also stand for the battlers, the pensioners and the families who are now doing it tough. Some of the state's most vulnerable groups have been hit with power price increases up to 30%. And as it was recently reported in the West Australian, we now find that previously confidential advice by Synergy to the government shows that the doubling of the supply charge would disproportionately affect some needy customers. Again, I don't think it's fair that people like pensioners and others on low incomes should face the pain while certain businesses and certain sectors are shielded. Now, I know the budget was sold to us as a deficit repairer. However, it does seem to be lacking in some areas. For instance, limiting expenses by itself does not repair a budget. We also need to diversify and increase our income. This budget does not do that. The government could save money throughout the budget. For example, the projects such as the Ocean Reef Marina. That could help fund or go a long way towards funding another 500 police officers. But no, another vanity project for northern suburb voters. Madam President, I can't express my disappointment. How disappointed I am in the government's approach to the police. The lack of respect shown to these dedicated people by this government is just shocking. There can be no doubt in my mind that this government will soon be the prima facie cause of lawlessness in West Australia. Our laws are weak and the enforcement of those laws is even weaker. Our men and women play a significant role in keeping our communities safe, yet this government has failed to consider their most basic needs. As an ex-police officer, I understand that WA needs an effective, reliable and responsive police to counter emerging security threats and enforce the law. This cannot be achieved if our police officers are not fully resourced and operate with a high morale. The government understood this apparently before the election and promised a pay deal of 1.5%. Since election, that pay deal has been reneged upon. There's no doubt in my mind WA Police face a number of crises. Firstly, there's a crisis of confidence in the government to provide for our police and a crisis in community safety. Our intrepid and hard-working police simply don't have the resources they need to deal with the ever-growing workload. And now we have a new regulation coming in that the police have to deal with, the 1 metre rule for cyclists. And they want the police to prosecute potentially hundreds of these new complaints. I don't know who's going to do it. If that footage has to go to the Computer Crime Squad for analysis, it's going to take at least 2 years before any prosecution is made. That particular squad cannot now cope with the amount of work it has to do. Now, looking at the promotional budget papers, we see the government spruiking its law and order investments. The government's very proud to have created a few 24-hour police stations. It has, however, failed to mention that it hasn't employed any extra officers to staff these stations. It has created these stations at the expense of police officers having to permanently change their rosters and work on their rostered days off. That's what's actually happening out there. The truth is the government is placing even more pressure on already overloaded service. Something is going to burst with the police service, and I hope the government is ready for when that happens. Now, Madam President, in my maiden speech to this House on the 22nd of May this year, I made an appeal to all politicians and the government to consider introducing a workers' compensation style scheme for the police. I don't see that anywhere in budget papers. I cannot get a straight answer from the government when I've asked them. At least 3 times I've asked them when this is going to come in. I never get a straight answer. I really hope this year a workers' compensation scheme is going to be introduced. It's desperately needed. Now, aside from law and order, one of the biggest issues facing the East Metro region is one of congestion. Now, I would like to acknowledge there has been certain funds spent on a number of important transport projects in the electorate. We have the new 86 million traffic interchange at Roe Highway and Kalamunda Road in Forestfield. That's fantastic. 70 million Reed Highway dual carriageway between Alton Road and West Swan Road. And I'm glad to see some more investment in rail in an effort to alleviate some of the pressure on our clogged roads. I truly hope that the government can deliver on time and within budget. However, I must say I am disappointed that the government has not allocated any funds in the forward estimates to construct the long-awaited Morley to Ellenbrook rail line. All we find over the next 4 years is a relatively small amount of funding for planning and design. This is despite the government promising during the March election that it would commence work on the rail link by 2019 and finish in 2022. It's unclear still at this stage how the government will be able to fulfil its election promise. It was recently reported in the media that far from being fully funded and shovel-ready by 2019, the promised Ellenbrook-Morley line now appears to be contingent on Labor winning the next federal election. In other words, no federal funding has actually been secured for the project. Just a verbal promise from the federal opposition leader to provide some funds should he become minister at some point. It is impossible not to be sceptical of such promises made by federal Labor. Many West Australians and many members, Madam President, may remember former leader Kevin Rudd promised in 2007 a WA infrastructure fund of $100 million a year. And guess what? That never happened. In 2010, Wayne Swan promised a $2 billion WA infrastructure fund. Again, it never materialised. What guarantee do we have that Bill Shorten, if he becomes Prime Minister, will deliver even a cent? The answer is we don't have any guarantees at all. Now, I certainly hope Ellenbrook does get a train line. It's desperate for one. It's a fast-growing area in need of major infrastructure investment. I just wonder how the government thinks it's going to make this happen. Even during recent Senate estimates, it was revealed the McGowan government hasn't submitted a business case yet to Infrastructure Australia for the Ellenbrook rail line, or any part of Metronet. Members will no doubt recall that the previous Liberal National Government was absolutely smashed over its failure to deliver this promise to Ellenbrook. I hope the government does not repeat this same mistake. The people of Ellenbrook, including myself, who live nearby, are sick and tired of these broken promises. Now, while I'm talking about infrastructure, I would like to briefly make a point about the long-term planning in this budget, or the lack of any long-term planning. The government talks about reducing congestion and improving services, but it's difficult to see how this will be achieved with Perth's population set to soar. With projections that the population of Perth and surrounds is going to swell by around 75% to around 3.5 million people, the government appears to be flying blind as we hurtle towards a much bigger city. The major parties are eager to promote and facilitate rapid growth through high immigration, but have failed to outline how they are going to finance and build the infrastructure needed to accommodate all these extra people. Perth has previously experienced breakneck rates of population growth over the last decade, and many established residents feel like their quality of life are now under threat. The major parties and the Treasury need to realise that maintaining population growth at such a high level for an extended period of time will require massive ongoing investment in the state's rail and road infrastructure networks. Not to mention schools, hospitals, water, energy, and all the other physical and social infrastructure. If the population were to increase by 75%, then that stock of infrastructure will also need to expand by at least 75% in order to avoid overload and prevent degradation in living standards. In a submission to the Australian Productivity Commission inquiry into infrastructure provision and funding, the University of Queensland academic Dr Jane O'Sullivan noted, and I quote, "What is missing from the political discourse about infrastructure funding is the loss of productivity due to crowding of our existing infrastructure and services. Providing additional capacity to restore lost productivity gives no net benefit to the position of the average Australian business or citizen. Asking them to pay a user charge for this new capacity to replace what was taken from them by population growth obviously leaves them worse off. Normally, when someone takes away something you own and then demands payment to have it restored to you, this is called extortion. Look, according to Dr O'Sullivan, providing infrastructure for population growth is not actually an investment in the conventional sense. Rather, it should be considered a recurrent cost required in order to simply maintain existing productivity levels and standards of living. Economists will call this capital widening at the expense of capital deepening. To use Dr O'Sullivan's words again, there is no prospect whatever for the infrastructure currently planned by the government to increase per capita productivity sufficiently more than that lost through crowding in order to repay the debt with interest. Our current high need for additional infrastructure is not a one-off situation. It is recurrent as long as population growth is sustained. Now, Madam President, the government can keep pouring record amounts of borrowed money into so-called congestion-busting projects year after year. Unless population slows to a more moderate growth, WA will keep slipping further behind in infrastructure and services. Given the costs associated with rapid population growth, it would be prudent for the government to develop long-term population strategy aimed at maximising the quality of life for existing residents. The state government should also urge Canberra to reconsider its de facto Big Australia policy, which is, of course, the prime driver of rapid population growth in WA and elsewhere in the country. Aside from slowing down the population growth, and thus forestalling the need for a costly expansion of infrastructure, we need to be smarter in terms of how we finance long-term infrastructure projects in this state. One Nation have previously, pre-election, proposed the creation of a WA Infrastructure Finance Corporation. Such an entity would be financed with seed funding and direct public funding and operate on a commercial basis. The establishment of a WA Infrastructure Finance Corporation would reduce state deficit and debt by taking some of the long-term financing of major infrastructure projects. It could raise its own funds for infrastructure development and provide long-term concessional loans to support strategic projects in WA. This would improve intergenerational equity. Long-term infrastructure would be financed using long-term loans so that the future generations benefiting from the asset also shared in paying off the cost of the investment. This will allow WA to finance and construct major projects while earning a return for the taxpayer. It would allow the government to cut its budget expenditure on infrastructure, freeing up funds for either to pay down or invest in education, health, families, policing and other areas. It would also reduce the need for so-called asset recycling, selling off public assets to fund new infrastructure, and mean less foreign ownership of our assets. Madam President, the government says this is a budget. The budget is a roadmap for fiscal repair. I would say this budget is a lost opportunity and full of broken promises. It risks inflicting a lot of unnecessary pain in the gold mining sector for little benefit, targeting the gold miners for a royalty hike while giving a free pass to those multinationals making mega profits. It would not have made a significant dent in the state's debt. It would only cost jobs and hurt regional communities, which, I might add, are already set to suffer thanks to the government's decision to effectively disembowel the Royalties for Regions programme. This budget is also a risk to our community because it fails to consider the needs of our police officers. This will be palpably felt in all of our communities going forward. Now, as we all know, WA is being ripped off under a shockingly unfair GST redistribution system. If the GST was distributed on an equal per capita basis, WA would receive $6.6 billion in GST in 2017-18. Instead, we will only receive a third of that, $2.2 billion. And as a result, the state will need to borrow more. Meanwhile, the eastern states continue to treat Western Australia like an ATM. WA does the economic heavy lifting, while the other states, which produce very little, reap the benefits. Indeed. As economist Leith Van Onselen has observed, and I quote, "It's a bit rich for the big parasitic eastern states to run population Ponzi economies that exacerbate their enormous external imbalances, while boosting their own GST allotments at the expense of surplus economies like Western Australia." While it's frustrating for ordinary West Australians, it's the unwillingness or the inability of the political establishment to fix the GST mess. Labor and the Liberal national bosses in Canberra have not lifted a finger to help WA to reform the unfair GST redistribution system, a system which is undermining federation. They may indeed express their sympathies with our plight from time to time, but never follow through with any firm action. And lately we've had the federal opposition, the Honourable Bill Shorten, do exactly the same, confirming he's not going to do anything to fix the GST mess should he be elected. Now, while the major parties have utterly failed West Australians on the GST, I'm glad that at least the Commonwealth Grants Commission has finally signalled changes that will allow states to increase their mining royalty rates and keep at least 50% of the additional income. If such reforms are indeed implemented, WA may be in a position to enact a temporary budget repair levy that could be spread over those in the resource sector most able to afford it. I also believe the government needs to consider lifting the foreign buyers tax, surcharge rather, on the purchase of residential properties. We have a proposal for 4%. A 4% surcharge is neither a major revenue raiser nor a deterrent to foreigners entering the WA housing market and pricing out the locals. Whatever the government's reason for implementing the surcharge on foreign buyers, it does not appear to be terribly effective at the current rate. Rather, it's a half measure at best. I note that Victoria recently more than doubled its surcharge on foreign buyers to 7%. The Canadian province of British Columbia last year implemented a 15% tax on foreign buyers, with Ontario soon following suit. The WA state government's 4% surcharge seems pretty paltry in comparison. Now, contrary to what is reported in the media, One Nation is prepared to work alongside the government in good faith to amend the budget and tackle our state's alarming debt problem. However, the government must be prepared to negotiate and compromise with us. It cannot continue to break promises it made before the election without any consequence. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, it gives me great pleasure to make a contribution to the Estimates and Revenue and Expenditure Consolidated Account Estimates Budget Reply this afternoon. And as members know, we are in very difficult economic times in Western Australia, with a state debt around approximately $1 billion, I should say, and there will be difficult times ahead with deficits for years to come. The pain is not just being felt in government, but reverberates through the entire community. Increased fees and charges on government services like power and water is putting financial pressure on families, singles, pensioners and businesses. The unemployment rate is still hovering at just under 6%, but of those employed, it's estimated approximately 140,000 people are underemployed in part-time work. In fact, an article in the Sunday Times on the 8th of October this year by political editor Joe Spagnolo reported the number of Western Australians claiming the dole has jumped by more than a third in just 3 years, with more than 95,000 people now on unemployment benefits. New figures released by Social Services Minister Christian Porter show the harsh realities of a troubled state, with the WA economy still reeling from a mining slump that has seen unemployment rise to 6.2% in 2016-17, the highest rate in 15 years. WA Treasury is forecasting unemployment to be about 6% this financial year, while 70,973 people were receiving New Start and Youth Allowance in June 2014. That figure has now swelled to 95,496, meaning the number of dole recipients has increased by 24,523, or a 34% increase in just 3 years. WA Council of Social Services, to appeal to the Labor government to do more to stimulate jobs, CCI Chief Economist Rick Newman said yesterday, WA was now 88% of the way down the business investment cliff. Once investment returns to positive territory and new jobs are added, we will see the entire economy start to recover, he said. But he warned that any increases in taxes would only hamper economic recovery. To stimulate business investment, WA must be seen as a stable place to invest. He said increased taxes on business, particularly payroll tax, does the opposite, making WA the most expensive state to create new jobs. So, members, we do have some problems, particularly in the jobs sector, and this sort of, as I say, reverberates all the way down the line, particularly to the housing market, which is generally the canary in the cage. Median house prices have continued to fall over the last 2 years. We've had negative growth for 2 years. So, that certainly is a sign that things are pretty tough out there. The way I see it, there's 4 main levers that the government can pull in balancing a budget. The first is to borrow money, and of course we were asked in this place earlier in the year to approve a loan bill for $11 billion for the term of this government. And it'd be interesting to see whether we actually get asked again before the term's up, whether there's more money that's going to be needed. The government can raise taxes, which is evident in increased fees and charges on the community in power, water and payroll tax. Assets can be sold to reduce debt and lower interest charges, currently in excess of $1 billion a year. And lastly, the government can cut spending. And unusual for a Labor government, they have taken the knife to the machinery. Government redundancies, pay freezes and salary increase limits of $1,000, estimated to save around $500 million. And there's been some blood spilt in this area with some big redundancy payouts. It may be a while before any financial benefit is derived from those cuts, or it's revealed that we've had a brain drain within our departments and our services start to be cut. There was an article in the West Australian by Gary Adshead on this issue where he writes, by introducing a voluntary targeted redundancy scheme or a public service job shredder, the McGowan government will get 3,000 salaries off its books. But, and it's a big but, state debt will still have risen to $43.6 billion and will still have a deficit of $1.1 billion in 3 years. And to reach a point of trying to persuade the public that Labor will get the finances back on track, Premier Mark McGowan has had to rip up an emphatic promise made on the March election campaign trail. He categorically ruled out raising taxes if elected because West Australians had had enough. Well, he's just broken his word and is blaming an unforeseen $5 billion worth of write-downs in government revenue since Labor came to power. The Premier says he's sorry, but the truth is his pre-election promises were foolish. So, members, taxes are continuing to rise, and just speaking of government efficiencies, a case in point is the Firearms Licensing Division, which last term of government we had a disallowance motion on some massive fees that were part of a cost recovery program. That disallowance motion was supported by the then opposition, the Labor Party, and a couple of Liberal members in government had crossed the floor on the issue. It was a fairly significant issue with significant rises that put us way above other jurisdictions. There was a parliamentary inquiry on those fee rises, but it was found that the cost recovery was substantiated, but on a very inefficient and a very clunky system. So despite millions of dollars being spent on a new processing system, which includes not only firearms but liquor licensing and pawnbrokers, but predominantly firearms, that's been in place for about 18 months. The system is still no cheaper, the system's still no more efficient, and I get complaints constantly about inaccuracies on firearm licences that have been issued and on their details. There's also been a recent policy change, particularly on transport and Australia Post, which is unnecessarily impacting on the industry. I had an email today where one firearm dealer is closing his doors. He can no longer continue because of a lack of supply. Conditions have been put on carriers. Those carriers, there's only some, I think about 13, that's been proposed that actually will carry firearms or are approved to carry firearms, but most of those are only basically in the city. So a lot of country firearm dealers are now finding that they are not able to get stock, and those businesses are right on the verge of failing unless something's done very, very soon. This is particularly a problem for primary producers out in the regions. So borrowing money is the quickest way to make sure that bills can be paid and the lights stay on, but like any debt, it has to be paid back. It comes with the side effects of interest charges, which is a further burden on the expenditure side of the ledger. There's been a lot of talk about good debt and bad debt by governments, both state and federal, as they try and justify their struggling and runaway deficits. But members, there's no such thing as good debt. That's a bit of a fantasy. And there's necessary debt, but sooner or later we've got to pay it back. If this state's to get back into the black, and it'll take a fair bit of political will in applying austerity measures on expenditure, it could free up $1 billion a year that we're spending on interest. And that $1 billion a year, or it's a little over $1 billion a year, could be spent on schools and health and increasing our police force and some of the things that are very important to the community. Or even cut fees and charges and taxes on the community so that their standard of living can be improved. As at the 30th of June this year, the WATC, or the West Australian Treasury Corporation, their total borrowing stood at $44.9 billion, a significant amount of money. And the prospect of that debt rising beyond $50 billion in the next few years is very probable, unless there's significant changes that are made to reel that in. Rather than get the crystal ball out and hope that there's a magical turnaround at some point as part of an economic cycle, they need to do more than that. I mean, the last government tried that method and the upswing never materialised. So there has to be more than hope that there will be a recovery. The budget forecasts gross state product to lift from 0.25% in 16-17 to 3% in 17-18, which is a 12-fold increase. A significant increase. And if that's being relied upon as part of the debt reduction program, then I fear for the future. Of course, the other option is to raise taxes and service charges to provide revenue for the government, but this places an impost on the community and businesses. Increased power charges, vehicle registrations, water rates, they all lower the standard of living for Western Australians, particularly for vulnerable Western Australians. And people in general will reduce spending. Business taxes such as payroll tax, which is a tax on jobs should be phased out, not raised, to provide more business incentive to invest and create jobs and not put more impost on those businesses. It's a real handbrake on enterprise and increases the cost of doing business in Western Australia. And it's up to governments really to provide a good business environment within Western Australia to stimulate the market And an issue comes to mind just around the election time, just before the election. There's some talkback radio on ABC 720 about the stadium footbridge, which had been contracted to a Malaysian company for around $40 million. And I can't remember who it was, but it was a member from the department said, "Oh, we don't have the expertise in Western Australia to build this bridge." Then one of the institutes of fabricators got on the radio and said, "Well, yes, we actually do have the expertise here in Western Australia to build the footbridge." And then the department came back and said, "Oh, well, it all gets back to cost." So it came to mind that in Western Australia we impose occupational health and safety standards, which we need to have, payroll tax, land tax, stamp duties, and everything else in this state that's an impost on business. Then we go and rub salt in the wound by saying, "Oh, look, we're not going to build the bridge here because you're too expensive." And so they contracted a company in Malaysia. As it turns out, that company in Malaysia, the wheels fell off that whole thing, and now we're looking at $90 million to build that footbridge here in Western Australia. So, if we had a decent business environment in the first place in Western Australia, with cheaper power and less taxes, then maybe we would have had that built here in the first place. Often taxes like payroll tax, stamp duty and land tax, when increased, will have diminishing returns for the state as companies cut overheads, reduce spending and enterprise slows down. People stop buying cars or properties, which reduces your stamp duty, and there's less revenue for the state. And this has been evidenced in reverse. You have to sort of bear with me a little bit here, but it's been evidenced in reverse with the first home owner scheme on page 153 of Budget Paper 3, where it forecasts that expenditure on the first home owner scheme is expected to be reduced by $26.5 million, in line with weaker expected demand. So that's basically saying that with the reduced demand on building new homes, that the applications and claims for the first home owner scheme is going to reduce by $26.5 million, which is very telling. So you have a diminishing returns. And first home buyers entering the market are really the initial drivers of any real estate market. So it demonstrates that taxes, charges can be increased, but if productivity, investment and spending decline, then the tax burden causes a further contraction of the economy, which basically evaporates a lot of what the expected return would be. Now, on a positive note, notwithstanding that the $5,000 boost was abolished to save $21.5 million, and that might have been less than $21.5 million because obviously there was going to be a slowdown, or there's going to be a slowdown predicted. It's pleasing to see that the government did retain the $10,000 first home owner scheme for new buildings, and also the stamp duty concessions for first home buyers if they buy a house or they buy some property. I mean, these concessions are crucial to an already struggling new home building and real estate industry. So it's very good to see that we do have those retained, even though there's going to be a $26.5 million reduction in applications, which kind of contradicts the forecast of gross state product lift from 0.25% to 3% if they're seeing that the housing industry is going to reduce substantially over the next few years. Now, there's been some recent media on housing affordability being the best it's been in decades. And in fact, the Housing Minister, Peter Tinley, was crowing about the fact that housing affordability is the highest it's been in many, many years. And I'm sure there's many affordable housing advocates here that would welcome that. Unfortunately, housing affordability has not improved because of wages growth and a better economic climate. The affordability has improved because property values have continued to decline. And this is a negative reason for affordability to increase, not a positive one. So if you don't own a property and you're entering the real estate market, well, it's good news for you. Affordability is good. But if you've bought a property in the last 5 years, then things are going to be very diabolical for you, particularly if there's issues such as job losses or a relationship breakdown and you have to sell that house. Many people are going to be selling homes for less than what their mortgage is. And there was an article in The Australian which focused on this issue recently. This is back in September, where they reported that signs of rising mortgage stress has emerged at the rate of missed home loan payments across Australia as it hits a 5-year high, and more than $26 billion worth of mortgages have fallen behind. Even with the official cash rate sitting at a record low, mortgage delinquencies hit record highs in the mining downturn hit states of Western Australia, Northern Territory and South Australia, where unemployment is squeezing more borrowers, according to figures tracked by Moody's. Moody's said Western Australia, with a rate of 2.96%, bore the brunt of the rising mortgage delinquencies, driven by a weak economy and falling house prices. Underemployment hit 10.4% in Western Australia in May, well above the national average of 8.8%. House prices in Perth fell 2.1% over the year to July and have fallen more than 2 years. More than 7% of home loans in the Western Australian outback were overdue in May. So a lot of stress for those people who are currently in the real estate market, maybe in the mortgage belt, particularly if their jobs are on the line. So even though affordability has improved, it's really not good news for everyone. A family home is really, for most people, their single biggest investment asset, and it underpins their personal wealth. And of course, with a home, there's an emotional attachment too. So if you fall behind on your payments and you're forced out of that home, it's not just a financial loss, it's a very strong emotional loss as you've turfed out into the street. So, with these delinquencies, I'm sure that there will be bank foreclosures increase, and that's not good for anybody. Now, further impacting property prices is the introduction of a 4% foreign owner duty surcharge on residential property, expected to raise $48 million. And the Honourable Charles Smith said that it's a bit low, it should be higher at 7% for foreign investors. But time will tell whether investors actually shy away from the WA market. It's always quite popular to say, well, foreign investors come in, we'll tax them so that they're not competing so heavily with the local market. But at the end of the day, we do need foreign investment in Australia and in the state. And so we'll see whether that 4% deters them over time. Well, we're certainly not making any donations to local government members anyway, Honourable Darren West, at this point in time. I'll make sure that we do. I'll make sure that we do. Now, the other issue is... Madam President, I seek your protection and be able to continue with my speech.
The Honourable Rick Maz has got the call. I'm sure others will have an opportunity, if they so choose, at a later stage. The Honourable Rick Maz.
Thank you, Madam President. Of course, the other option is asset sales, and we've seen during the election campaign that the Liberal government was planning on selling Western Power, and the Labor Party had campaigned on not selling that asset. But the total increase on residential electricity tariff in this budget and out to the forward estimates is 27%. And that will compound and increase as time goes on. The wholesale supply of electricity in this state is contestable for industrial and large commercial users. It's only the domestic and small business users that are forced to buy their electricity from Synergy. Synergy has a legislative monopoly on the sale of electricity to residential and other customers who do not consume a large amount of electricity. If this government really wants to phase out its retail subsidy, then it needs to reform the retail market and allow generation markets to compete as well. It needs to allow gas retailers to enter the electricity market. It needs to encourage the use of smart meters so users can manage their demand and therefore reduce their costs. It needs to change the rules that prevent Western Power from providing cheap standalone electricity out on the edge of the network grid. It needs to bring real competition into the domestic and small business retail market for electricity. We have seen it work in the retail gas supply, where there's been significant competition in the retail gas supply and discounts of up to 30%. The consumer benefits. If you use a gas heater in winter, you can shop around for the best deal on gas. But if you use a reverse cycle air conditioner, then the government can say, well, take it or leave it, it's a monopoly. I point out that the government doesn't have a monopoly in the generation of electricity. There is plenty of privately owned generating capacity out there, like blue water. Only ordinary Western Australians can't access it under the government rules. If there's going to be meaningful competition in the electricity market, then that competition has to extend to generators, not just retailers. If the government is already subsidising electricity charges, then introducing retail competitors alone won't stand up. It's no good competing on a retail price when it's already lower than the wholesale price. It defies the laws of business gravity. There's a limit on how much the government can milk the taxpayer and businesses in Western Australia. Unless it's prepared to do something other than increase taxes and fees and charges, I think it will find the limit. The community has been the subject of increasing power costs as the government winds back its subsidies. The impact on small business and struggling households has seen the application of HUGS assistance skyrocket as vulnerable people feel the financial pain of keeping the lights on. An article in the West Australian last month by Daniel Mercer with the headline, "Electric Shock." More households than ever are seeking help to pay their power bills with the big increase in applications to the state government's hardship fund in the past 3 months. Official figures show that more than half of the $20 million allocated for the hardship utility grant scheme has been spent in the first quarter of this financial year, as an 11% increase in power bills begin to bite. Almost 20,000 applications have been made to state-owned power provider Synergy by people struggling to afford their bills. The figure for 3 months to the end of September compared with 27,000 applications in the 16-17 year, a figure that was nearly 3 times the number of applications in the previous financial year. Under HUGS, people in financial distress can apply for grants of up to $581 a year for help to pay their electricity, gas and water bills. Residents above the 26 parallel can apply for $962. The state's welfare lobby said the latest figures were alarming but not surprising given WA's economic troubles and the size of cost of living increases in the budget. So as the cost of living goes up, of course, people's standard of living goes down. If it's going to repair the budget and provide cheaper power to the residents and small business community, then the government needs to consider and investigate the sale of Synergy. In 2014-15, Synergy's revenue was $3.2 billion. And I know that this government's not really enamoured with selling assets, but there was an interview in 2014 between John McGlew and who was then the Shadow Treasurer, now Treasurer Ben White. And part of that transcript, John McGlew asked, "So what assets do you think are appropriate to be sold?" And Ben replies, "Well, I think it's those assets that ultimately can. That does service the private sector in the main, that assets that can charge a user pays model along the way doesn't necessarily require subsidy from government." And at the moment, I think some of those port infrastructures, I think the government has made the point around Kwinana Bulk Terminal. John McGlew asked, "You're the Shadow Treasurer, what are your ideas? What assets do you think could be sold?" Ben White, "Broadly, the principles I look to are those assets being used in the main to benefit the private sector? Are those private sector industry providing or being charged an appropriate fee or a user pays? If so, then that may be an appropriate vehicle, an appropriate asset to remove off the state's balance sheet and redirect that money to retiring debt." John McGlew, "What about the state's energy assets? Could you see some of Synergy generation power plants being sold, for example?" Ben White, "Well, I think Eric Ripper in his retirement speech made the right point, and that is, at some point, I think it is inevitable that energy assets will be sold." So there we have it from our current Treasurer that hasn't said no to selling Synergy. And look, I don't know what Synergy's worth. I don't know if any modelling's been done on Synergy, but if Synergy was worth somewhere around the $10 billion mark, for argument's sake, that was to reduce debt, that could save us $250 million a year in interest payments. So it would certainly help the state out and reduce our debt. Now, look, I'm a believer in privatisation, and I believe that capital should be in the hands of the people, where people have the incentive and the innovation to create services and efficiencies. Otherwise, they simply won't survive. So I can see that the benefits of selling assets like Synergy to provide competition and reduce energy costs and reduce state debt. However, there are some institutions that government must stay in control of, fundamental services like policing, for argument's sake. So when I read that there are plans to sell Landgate, then I have a problem with that. I mean, Landgate is an institution that holds the titles for every Western Australian in this state that underpins the wealth of the entire state. It contains very sensitive information, and the security of that Torrens title system within Landgate is paramount to the whole economic fabric of the state. So to consider selling Landgate, I think, would be a very poor move. There are other assets the government could sell, like Synergy, which would also provide a level playing field for other retailers that enter the energy market if they're not competing against a GTE and are actually competing against another private enterprise. So I just hope that the government sees good sense in not privatising Landgate. Now, the other, or the fourth lever that can be pulled is to cut spending. And looking through this budget, I think it's still a fairly big spending budget. There have been increased fees and charges, but there's also been concession cuts, and the poor old pensioners have copped it again. I think the last term of government we've seen the pensioner rebate on rates, water rates and council rates reduced down to $550 a year for council rates and $600 for water rates. In this budget, that cap's been reduced down now to $100 each for water and for water rates, which is a bit harsh on those pensioners and those older Western Australians who obviously own their own home. They've probably spent a lifetime paying off a mortgage. They own their own home. They're not a burden on the state housing system, and a little bit of a reward might be a concession on their rates. But no, along with high utility prices, the poor old pensioners have copped a bit of a kick in the teeth with a cap of $100 each on those things. That's right. Now, in contrast, we've seen spending on such items as a wave energy research centre, $19.5 million, a smart rider ticketing system upgrade, $34 million. I've spoken to a few people. The smart rider system actually works quite well for them, so I don't know why we need to go and spend another $34 million on upgrading that. $48.3 million for assistance for schools, which is great if you can afford it, but at a time of austerity, I think that's something that maybe could wait. Unfortunately, things are tough. Some things need to be sacrificed. Now, I'll touch on the Rural Fire Service. The Honourable Colin de Grassa went into some detail about the Rural Fire Service and the importance of establishing a Rural Fire Service and the recent ERA report on setting up that Rural Fire Service. Now, I confess I haven't read the whole report. I've read the key outline of that report, which would suggest that the cheaper model's around $4 million to establish, which I think would be very, very good value for money. It's something that the community has been crying out for some time. We had the Ewan Ferguson report, which recommended a separate Rural Fire Service. We've now had this ERA report that's recommending, or not recommending, but suggesting that a Rural Fire Service is actually quite affordable. And when you look at items like $4 million for regional films, a regional films project, it's again prioritising the expenditure. You know, do we spend $4 million on a regional films project, or do we put $4 million into a Rural Fire Service? So I think things are a bit skewed there, and it's about prioritising what's important to the community rather than pork barrelling. I must say that I'm very disappointed in the $10 million cut from local government road funding grants, which was in retaliation to the disallowance motion that we had on preventing the removal of concessions on motor vehicle stamp duties and registrations. You know, country roads are very important to this state. Not only do they provide access for farmers when it comes to transporting fertiliser or grain. We also know that the road toll in country Western Australia is much higher than what it is in metropolitan Western Australia. And of course road conditions can play a big part in that. Not only have we limited many of the country shires from being able to maintain and build new roads, but it's been suggested to me that some jobs out there are on the line too, because if the local shire can't afford to maintain and build those roads, they may not need the staff to operate the machinery as well. So, it's one of those things, I think, where it was a poor move on the government's part to reduce that road funding grant. Certainly there's other areas that could have been cut if a prudent eye was cast over some of that expenditure. So we're looking at $9.5 million on the Wave Energy Research Centre, where we're already closing down 300 megawatts of generating capacity due to an oversupply, and yet we can't spend $10 million on road funding grants, which is another poor example of prioritising. So, members, I think there's a lot more that can be done in selling assets, sharpening the pencil, realising department efficiencies, prioritising expenditure and implementing austerity measures in these tough economic times. I suppose only time will tell if this government has the ticker and good judgment to turn things around.
Honourable members, the question before the House is the tabled budget papers being noted. I call the Honourable Simon O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Mr Acting President. Yes, I think we should note these budget papers. This is the first budget of the new government. And I wanted to comment a little bit about what we might look for in the first budget of a new Labor government. And there's a few key indicators that I might be able to share with you which might be of assistance to the House, Mr Acting President. In the course of my brief comments this afternoon, I will be touching on credit ratings. I want to talk a little bit about Ellenbrook Rail that's been raised from time to time, a bit of a perennial there, and I'll come to that. And I want to tell you a little bit about the sort of things that members might find it useful to bear in mind when analysing this budget being the first of a new Labor government. Because you see, Mr Acting President, many of this lot here and in another place have actually been here before. They've got some form. And in a moment I want to take you back to 2001 to have a look at what happened there and look for the parallels that are already emerging in 2017. I'm not going to be getting too much into hackneyed political phrases like hypocrisy, but some of you might identify that theme starting to emerge as you contemplate successive Labor governments. Arrogance is another word which is bandied around freely, but one word I do want to introduce you to is dissembling, because that is a characteristic that I've noticed of successive Labor governments in particular. And if you have a look at your thesaurus and look at the word dissembling, you'll find synonyms all about putting on a false front, about putting up a smoke screen. Words like sham, fake, four-flush, conceal, cloak, camouflage, cover up. That's what we've seen in the past, and I think that's what we're already starting to see now. So let's contemplate briefly, as we note these present papers, Mr Acting President, the last time Labor came into office. Well, I have some memories of that back in 2001. There's some similarities. Jeff Gallop was the Labor leader and the new Premier then, you might recall. And what did Kevin Reynolds, another redoubtable commentator around the town and a good Labor man, have to say? He said, well, Gallop and his crew, they're like the dog that chased the car and caught it. Didn't know what to do with it then. We've had these debates and used those lines before, but it was true. What we did see was some determination by the incoming Treasurer, the Honourable Eric Ripper, not to repeat the disastrous government actions of the previous WA Inc era Labor governments. And he's told us that himself in his farewell speech to the other place. And so slash and burn came to be the recipe in terms of his approach to government action. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how that happened, and you might contrast it with your own observations of the day if you cast your mind back. Let's talk about road funding, for example. That was one of the first major casualties. Now, I'm particularly aware of this because I observed how it affected my region at the time, adversely. And of course, later on, I became the first Liberal Transport Minister since, I think, the Honourable Cyril Rushton, who I doubt if any of us knew, so I was a bit of a novelty at the time. But we're dealing with events far before that. What happened with the capital expenditure allocated to road funding? Well, in the lead up to the 2001 election, under Ministers Eric Charlton and Murray Criddle, both of whom were members of this place and both of whom I've since had occasional dealings with since, I'm glad to say. Decent men. But one thing that Eric Charlton, who was a bit of an individual, let's face it, one of the things that he did was he developed and got through the cabinet of the day in the time of the Richard Court government a very large road funding program to try and make sure that we had the road infrastructure to meet the needs of the state as it grew, and to make sure that the users of roads, and by nature, of course, that's all of us, could be as safe as could possibly be in using those roads. And we'd already seen a lot of progress. Do you remember the Kwinana Freeway, south from Leach Highway, in the days of the Dowding and Lawrence governments? Well, the freeway was a bit extended, but everywhere you came to an intersection, there was traffic lights. And when you were a member for South Metro region with your office at Canning Bridge, and you had to get down to Rockingham or Secret Harbour and places all the time, it was quite something to notice that you, as far as Thomas Road, all you had was the ongoing set of traffic lights. Stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. Big trucks having to stop and start, pushing out all their diesel particulates, the noise that went with it. And then, of course, by the time you got to Thomas Road, it didn't go anywhere. So you go down Johnson and up Miller and all those roads cutting through the back way up, Kerosene Lane and all those sorts of places to get to your destination south of Rockingham. Well, it was great when Minister Criddle, who was responsible at the time, finally completed the work that was needed to repair that situation and prepare the Kwinana Freeway for the future. Let me briefly tell you what the scope of work was, Mr Acting President. It not only involved all the grade separations at all of those roads, those major intersections down south of where I've mentioned, but it involved all the liaison that was necessary with the local residents and so on. It's not easy retrofitting that sort of infrastructure where in many cases there's communities have developed, but it had to be done and it was done. You know what else had to be done? Half the freeway had to be moved about 30 metres to one side, because when it was initially put there was no room allowed in the middle for a future railway to go down the middle. So you move one whole carriageway of the freeway a little bit to one side. Then you put up your grade separations, all those bridges that you're all familiar with and that you pass not infrequently. The other thing, and that was opened before the 2001 election, it was great. You saw a huge change overnight. Then the residents would tell us it's terrific. You know, all that stop-start noise has just disappeared. It was better for everyone's health. We got around a lot quicker, easier on your brakes as well. There was another part of that project, so I'm just going to mention a few examples. And the Kwinana Freeway also was built far beyond Thomas Road. I think it was about 13, 14 kilometres of extension from Thomas Road right the way round to Safety Bay Road. Now that really opened up that particular southwest corner of the metropolitan area, and it was just about ready to be opened at the time of the 2001 election. I'm going to refer to that in just a little minute. So what did Treasurer Ripper do? For better or worse, as he slashed and burned the funding programs? Well, he certainly got right into the road funding. And there was some substantial amounts of expenditure cancelled outright, and some of it deferred. And what did the Labor members of the day do about that? Well, I don't know what they did behind closed doors, but publicly I never heard a peep about it. There was a big project to upgrade the Collie Highway, and the Collie Highway is often looked at as a western half and an eastern half. Well, most of the western half was actually done under the Charlton Criddle ministerial responsibility, and that was terrific, and that was the higher priority. And the rest of it, the eastern part, if you like, was funded in the forward estimates to happen as well. There was a new member for Collie got elected then, champion of his local area. You know him, he's still around in the other place. Not a peep out of him. Nothing. When that funding was just ripped out from his community. And it was the same story right across the state, with new Labor members all elected because we're going to stand up for our community, and yet it was all taken out from underneath them. That's what happened back in 2001, 2002. And I'm going to come back to the Collie Highway when I get a bit of time. But there were some other aspects too about capital expenditure which was deferred. Just think about the Mandurah Railway, which now we probably could have played that better in opposition, I think, because it was actually a court government initiative, and much of the heavy lifting and funding had been arranged under the court government. But then, of course, under the Labor government, there are a few things happened. One of them, of course, was to change parts of the route, specifically north of Coburn into the city. And so that changed the dynamics in a number of ways. And as I say, in retrospect, we, dare I say I, could have all handled that debate about at the time a lot better, because what we tended to do was make it Labor's project, which was, from point of view of posterity, is a bit unfortunate. But it wasn't only about changing the route and so on. It wasn't about the fact that the large part of the purpose of that railway was to service electorates like Riverton and other electorates out Canning Vale way, places where the new Labor members didn't grizzle at all that their people weren't getting the train service that was initially set out to be provided. No, it all became about the changing of the route. But what it was also about, what it was, Mr Acting President, that those changes were made possible in a climate of capital infrastructure withdrawal, because all of that expenditure on the project was deferred. So members need to look out now to see how much money is one way or another being cancelled or how much is being deferred. And I think they might find that instructive. Of course, all of that was just the beginning, and there was plenty more to come. There was that failed Office of Shared Services experiment, which wasted hundreds of millions of dollars, just thrown away. And I'm going to come back to that in a little while. Then, of course, there are all the CCC investigations, minister after minister after minister resigning in disgrace. But, of course, plenty of other ministers have still endured. They've been through the time in opposition, and now they're back again. Will the leopard change its spots? Doubt it. I doubt it very much indeed. One little story I've told before to the House concerns the opening of that Kwinana Freeway extension back in 2001. It happened, I mean, to my recollection, it must have been, it seemed like the Saturday afterwards. It was probably a little bit later than that. And Mr Acting President, there was the new Minister, not of Transport, but of a thing called Planning and Infrastructure. Now, this Minister had been around various places. She'd actually spent the best part of a term in this House previously, and by this stage she was off being in another House. She later went to another House, and now she's back again, I'm delighted to say. It's a magical mystery too, and I remember she presided at the opening of that Kwinana Freeway extension from Thomas Road all the way down to Safety Bay Road. Myself and Barbara Scott were the members for South Metro. We were there. We weren't invited by the new government, of course. We were invited by the local council, the town of Kwinana, which was nice. Murray Criddle, the recent Minister for Transport, wasn't invited, which I thought was just a plain bitchy thing to do and typical of incoming Labor governments. And what we did have to do, though, Barbara and I, we were delighted to be there. We sat through a diatribe of 45 minutes talk about what wonderful road builders the Labor Party are. That's what we had to suffer through. And to add insult to injury, because it was a pain in the neck having to sit there, or a pain having to sit there, not one mention of those who had been involved in the funding and the driving of that project. Not one mention of Ministers Criddle or Charlton. Very bad form. But again, it's also about that word I used in my opening remarks about dissembling. And I think that's most regrettable. I wonder how much we've already seen of that. I wonder how much more we're going to see. Well, we shall see. But that's enough about a former government coming into office. Let me tell you about another former government when they came into office in 2008. Not 2009, of course, because there was an early election, a very early election, which ran in 2008. I know we've got a number of people opposite who still probably lie awake at night and think about what fun that was. Then Premier Carpenter, of course, Mr Acting President, decided out of the blue, without consultation with his colleagues, I don't know if anyone here was spoken to, off he went down to the Governor. I remember the Honourable Sheila McHale that used to accompany him everywhere at that stage. Went down and poor old Treasurer Ripper and his partner, our good friend, the Honourable Liliana Ravlich, who was then Minister for something or other, education, was it? I don't know. Local government by then. Oh, God, there's another poison chalice. I digress. They were off having a holiday somewhere up the coast, and they saw on the radio or somewhere that apparently they'd all resigned so that an election could be called. Well, were they really that ramshackle? You know, was that really what happened? Well, apparently it did, because not long afterwards I found myself as a new minister, and I went in and inherited an office on the 13th floor west of Jumar House. And guess who'd been the previous occupant of that office? None other than my colleague I referred to earlier, the Honourable Alana McTiernan, the nomadic, itinerant member who goes from house to house to house, and at that time was a member of the Assembly and a recent Minister for Planning and Infrastructure. So I had to do a few things. One, the dysfunctional Department for Planning and Infrastructure had to be dismantled, and a new Department of Transport was created. I'm proud of that achievement. And I might add, the officers that worked in that department were delighted to be a part of it. And I'll say some more about that on another occasion. But anyway, there I went. You can imagine it. You know, you're going up there and you're wondering what's going to happen now, and you think, well, go and take physical possession of this office. Because you haven't got any staff or anything, do you, at this stage? And so what do you think I found as I settled into that office and into that portfolio? Well, there was the others, the recent occupants had departed, not only in a state of high dudgeon, but at some haste. There wasn't much left. There was a bit of scorched earth. I wouldn't say they'd cleaned the place, cleaned out possibly, but there was a few things. There was a wretched old Christmas tree from about 1927 I found in a cupboard, and a few other things like that. A safe in the minister's office which was locked. Eventually got it open, there was nothing in there. But there was a few other things. Maybe there was a few empty bottles around, I don't know. But vases. But I'll tell you what, the vases, yes. But there was one thing there in great abundance as the weeks progressed and we established the new office: loose ends. That's what there were. There were stacks and stacks of loose ends, because Minister McTiernan had also been taken totally unawares by Premier Carpenter's desperate and precipitate action. And it had been a very busy job, and it always is with transport. But the things that I found were things left undone. Loose ends, as I say. We had a bunch of port authorities, the boards of which, in many cases, became inchorate because renewals hadn't been processed, because no one, or at least the Minister and her advisers, obviously didn't anticipate that the Premier would do something as precipitate as he did, like go to the Governor so early. Well, it's been an interesting election too. I've reminded members here before about one of my favourite moments. That was when Premier Carpenter was out there with a former colleague here, Graham Gifford. Now, at that stage it was then Mr Graham Gifford, because he'd left this place and become the Labor candidate for some place in East Metro. I think was it Swan Hills or something? One of those ones out there. Anyway, the promise was we're going to build a railway line to Ellenbrook. And I remember seeing Graham Gifford out there, not only being the nodding dod behind Carpenter doing the announcement, but he had this sign. You know, again, this is a great Labor tradition. Put up a sign saying you're going to do something. This will be the site of the new railway. And there he was, very energetically banging in this sign on the location of this new Ellenbrook railway line. Now, there was one person who I recall as being conspicuous in their absence. From that appearance, from that announcement, and from any discussion that followed thereafter. And who was that person? It was the Minister for Planning and Infrastructure. Not to be seen. Now, I can tell you, when I took over the ministerial office and inherited the detritus of what had passed for a Transport Department before, there were various things in process. Yes, there were appointments, and stacks of them, to be made to a whole lot of boards of port authorities and the like. and I got onto that promptly because it couldn't be done during a caretaker period. There were other reports from government agencies about projects in train, no pun intended, as you would expect, but not one thing about an Ellenbrook rail line. And so when the new Premier, Colin Barnett, asked me to have a look at this Ellenbrook rail line and advise the new cabinet, I said, righto. So I went looking and there was nothing. Couldn't even find anything scratched on the back of an envelope. There was no business case at all. It was simply a rash declaration made by a desperate Premier in the dying days of his administration. Oh, and Graham Gifford never got elected either, for the record, though I'd wish him well in whatever he is doing now. Nonetheless, there had been an undertaking given by the incoming government, or by the leader of the incoming government, and as a result of that, I tasked the PTA with examining the prospects of an Ellenbrook rail line and providing some fairly advanced advice to the new government. The advice I got, they didn't know where the proposal had come from, but even the most cursory examination, and I got them to do a lot more than cursory examination. I got them to do some detailed examination. The advice that I got about that particular project was, Minister, this project is a complete dog. Don't touch it. You cannot possibly justify it on any cost-effectiveness basis, on any principle of merit. And if you want to, because you've got a rush of blood, which says you're desperate to build a railway to Ellenbrook, bear in mind you'd be using so much of the transport infrastructure dollar that there would be a heck of a lot of other citizens of Western Australia that would miss out as a result. Now, in short, Mr Acting President, they're the sort of contemplations that a government has to take when determining how to expend finite dollars. And that's what happened. Now, apparently, we've got another pledge, years down the track, for another railway line to Ellenbrook. This one might even go underground. I was reading the paper that it might go underground. That'll be interesting, because that starts to bring us full circle now. Now we've got a new Labor government. I've identified some of the articles of form. I think members can see where I'm going with my remarks this afternoon. I'll bet you London Bridge to a brick that undertakings have been given about Ellenbrook Rail by this incoming government that don't stack up. Somewhere there is a vacuum, which is the homework that hasn't been done, and yet commitments are being made. And they're being dignified with this term Metronet. Everything's Metronet. Metronet this, Metronet that. Put a Labor badge on it, whether you originated the project or not. Hey, that sounds a little bit like the extension of the Kwinana Freeway down to Safety Bay Road back in 2001. Don't let the facts get in the way. Don't be scared to dissemble, to put up a smoke screen, conceal, cloak, camouflage, cover up, flush. And that's what we're seeing. Now, members might therefore be concerned to contemplate all of this in the context of the current budget, because here we go again, an incoming Labor government's first budget. Now, what I'm seeing is much of the same being practiced by people that I've seen practicing it before. Perhaps they're not going to learn by the the unfortunate outcomes of the past, but that doesn't mean that other members in this place should let them get away with it. So this is just the first of a number of budgets that this government will deliver, and I invite members to contemplate this or those budgets in light of some of the examples, and there are only a few that I've given today, because there's plenty more. And if the Honourable Sally Talbot I see is trying to move prematurely to give me an extension, but I don't need it just this. I have adequate time. Don't incur the wrath of your colleagues just yet. All right, well, I'll give you some more. Look at members opposite, Mr Acting President. I can't lip read, but I'm darn sure I saw at least one of them say, "For God's sake, Sally, shut up."
They wouldn't do that.
No, I'm sure they didn't. I'm sure I might need to clean my glass. I'm sure that wouldn't have been said. But it's all right. You asked for it. I'll give it to you. Now, I'm looking forward in the future to having a few tussles with the former Minister for Planning and Infrastructure, who's on urgent parliamentary business elsewhere. I can't believe it, but suddenly I was going to be in the same place, the same time as this house-hopping itinerant member of various parliaments would actually grace us again with her presence, and so I'm looking forward to.
Somewhere else, obviously.
I'm looking forward to that, but even in her absence, I hope she probably wouldn't mind if I give you one more story about what happens when governments come and go, because we've heard it from her and we've heard it from other members about what happens when there is a change of government and new governments come in and start opening the previous government's stuff. And that's just one of those things that happens. And I've heard the Honourable Alana McTiernan comment of this recently. Unfortunately, I was in a place where I couldn't really interject at the time, but in talking about who owns various projects, I want to point out to members that there are a lot of projects that, because of their scale and other factors, can tend to be very complex, and for statutory and other reasons can actually take years to come to fruition. And what happens is you actually have a lot of very big projects that persist over successive governments. And we heard some reference the other day in this place about who was trying to claim the credit for the Forest Highway. I hope I did that justice at that particular opening by pointing out that there were indeed several parents of this very good project. Remember the late Don Randall, the federal member for Canning, and the federal member for Perth? No, she was then the former Minister for Planning and Infrastructure, sitting in another place, were tit for tatting in the media about who'd done what. The fact is there have been a lot of people involved in that project, and I reminded people at the opening that it went back certainly to Minister Charlton and very definitely to Minister Criddle. That was something that hadn't been introduced, and I acknowledged them. I also acknowledged the input in the ministerial time of the Honourable Alana McTiernan. Now, some critics were saying at the time, and in the years leading up to it, because it was years, that she'd somehow been tardy in moving that project forward. What we've got to understand is, and maybe she was or she didn't like it particularly or whatever, I don't know, but I would point out that this was at a time when you had a treasurer that was, shall we say, a little parsimonious when it came to spending big sums of money, that there had to be a reliance for a massive project like this on federal funding being found and sourced. And in due course it was sourced and the project went on, and the project itself took a few years of construction. I know most of the construction, believe it or not, the vast majority of the construction happened in my watch. You know, I was the one that had to sweat over whether we were going to get enough weather to put those tens of thousands of tonnes of final seal on many kilometres of carriageway in time for the opening. But we got there in the end, and we did some other things as well. We extended the project because of some good economies that we were able to achieve. I managed to properly build what was going to be a simple road linking Mandurah with the now Forest Highway into a proper grade dual carriageway 4-lane highway called Manjagordup Drive, the longest single word street name that I think we've got, to my satisfaction. Main roads are most upset. They had to go and get a special sign made because using their compulsory letter signage it wouldn't fit on anything anyone had in stock. Well, we've all got the Honourable Stephen Dawson, we've all got some claim to fame. That at least is mine. Anyway, that was done, and in the course of that we had to build, believe it or not, railway tunnels. Now, there's been railway tunnels bit up here, very complicated exercise in the middle of Perth. I've actually built far greater length of railway tunnel than anyone else in this state. Now, it wasn't as difficult a job, and I haven't raised it before, but it just shows you those are the sort of things that happen as successive governments work through major detailed projects which take years to construct. But I'll tell you this, whether it was Don Randall or Murray Criddle or Eric Charlton or Alana McTiernan, they all got an invite to the opening and they were all mentioned as contributors to the project. Most of my comments actually were not only about the ministers, but about the thousands of men and women who had contributed to making this substantial and enduring piece of infrastructure. And I contrasted that with the bridge building capacity of my own father, who'd been part of a team back in the Depression days that have been involved in building some of the significant, substantial wooden bridges that even to this day you still see in the southwest along main roads. It was something to be proud of, and again, I'm certainly proud of the achievements of all of those people. Now, Mr. Acting President, I think I've made some points here which members might find instructive and might find useful. I wanted to get them on the record because I'm going to contrast all of that with the performance of this government as we see other budgets come forward. But there's one more thing I do want to leave you with, and that's a reference here, and this is bringing us right up to date now, to the question of credit ratings. Now, the Honourable Ben Wyatt, the current Treasurer, the erstwhile potential Leader of the Opposition, whose troops deserted him at the critical moment, but perhaps, who knows what's going to happen if Stephen Smith's not available? They might have to look elsewhere. But the Honourable Ben Wyatt was getting us all ready for something in recent weeks, wasn't he? He was preparing the commentariat, and he was preparing the people for Western Australia for something. It was a downgrade of the state's credit rating by Standard & Poor's and by Moody's. Now, I've debated this before with such knowledgeable people as the Honourable Darren West, so I'm not going to go into detail about credit ratings of the past.
Call him back.
Of the past. No, he's just down the local government department, I tell you. But let's come back to civilisation. The Honourable Ben Wyatt was getting us all ready, wasn't he? Getting us all ready for a downgrading.
Jawboning.
And he was like a kid waiting for Guy Fawkes night, wasn't he? He was so excited, he was almost quivering with anticipation.
Fingers crossed.
Oh, he had fingers and toes crossed, the Honourable Ewan Sidman. He did. He was hugging himself with some sort of delicious anticipation that the West Australia, the Crest Australian credit rating would be downgraded. And it was all going to be the former government's fault. Now, if you look at his media statement on the 31st of October, headed S&P, Global Ratings maintain WA's credit rating. I don't know exactly how this was dictated, Mr Acting President, but I think it would have been through clenched teeth. As he delivered the good news later on the TV, that great news that WA's credit rating had not been downgraded. Isn't that fabulous, he was saying through gritted teeth. Oh God, he was, I'm so happy. That was his attitude. And he says, because, you know, you might have thought that because of that previous government, we were headed for a downgrading. But oh joys, we're not. I think he did say at the time, however, in a sort of clutching at straws tone of voice, he said, however, we're still waiting for Moody's. So a few days later, Mr Acting President, on Friday the 3rd of November, the official media statement from the Treasurer's office said, Moody's reaffirms WA's credit rating. And then, of course, the ALP and the Wyatt McGowan commentary was all about, yes, despite this terrible set of books and all of that, despite all of that. And I've heard a few members, including one recently just this afternoon, talk about and adopt this nonsense Labor line that's been worn a little bit too thin with repetition about the state of the set of books that was inherited and how much of it could be put down to mismanagement and how much could be attributed to the fluctuations of global markets, of GSST inequities and a range of other matters. And I'm not saying that the former government didn't have some failings in this respect, but if you're going to be able to confront the issues of governing this state, you've got to do so honestly, or else you're going to get the wrong outcome. And if you've got to do that, if you're going to be dinkum with the people with Western Australia and certainly with this House, and that's why I'm raising this matter in the way I have for this House. So Ben had put out two media statements, one about Standard & Poor's on the 31st of October and one from about Moody's on the Friday the 3rd inst. And what was the subtext of this? Oh, bummer. They didn't downgrade. So now we can't belt the Liberal Party and the opposition. But it's worse, Ben, someone in his office would have said. It's worse, because now that that benchmark has been set, not by one worldwide ratings agency, but by two, now that that standard can be set, if in future there is a downgrade, the Labor Party and Treasurer Wyatt are going to own it. That's the disaster. So before you want to play this game of dissembling, just understand you'll get caught up in due course, just like former administrations have got caught up, because you can't maintain this line of dissembling forever. And I think it's a bad thing. It augurs badly for the new Labor administration that they've started in this way. So in conclusion, I think I said in 2001 in criticising the then new Labor government, starting to be a bit of a habit, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you. Consistent, constructive. I'm trying to help. This is the House of Review after all. One thing I said to, I think it was the Honourable Kim Chance, who was Leader of the House then, in quite a heated debate, when there was some scandal or other erupting, I said, you didn't expect to get elected. And I gave him the Kevin Reynolds quote again. You didn't expect to get elected. You don't know what you're doing. But normally a government, when swept into office, would have something positive to offer. A fresh program, some new enthusiasm, an intention to get on and do things. But then, of course, like, well, all governments come and go. They do. All governments come and go. That gives us some comfort as we now find ourselves in the depth of deepest, darkest opposition. All governments come and go. But as I pointed out to the Honourable Kim Chance on that day back in 2001 or whenever it was, normally a government goes through a new government goes through a period of optimism and leadership, whereas the government he was part of, in that particular matter that we were discussing at the time, I said you've skipped that step and gone straight from election to a government in decay. And what I'm seeing in some of the public utterances from this government are worryingly symptoms of the same. A government going straight from election to decay because they don't understand their responsibilities. They don't want to play a straight bat. They prefer to dissemble. They prefer to politic. They haven't got any manners, many of them. No, I said many of them. And I'm convinced from what I've seen, not only now but in the past, that this particular administration, if it's not very careful, is going to suffer the same way that some of their predecessors did. Indeed, some of them are the same personalities. So I don't have a great deal of interest in further discussion of this particular budget, but I can tell you I'm going to be watching very close through the same prism as further budgets unfold, as further press releases unfold, and let's see how often this government wants to continue to blame everyone else except themselves as they start to make problems themselves, which they already are and will continue to do so.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting President. Can I begin, Mr Acting President, by thanking the many honourable members who made a contribution to this debate, the budget statements debate. The contributions were, to say the least, expansive and covered a range of areas in relation to the budget. A number of members did acknowledge the financial mess left behind by the previous Liberal National Government. I think the Honourable Simon O'Brien, in his contribution, slightly acknowledged that, although others certainly recognised the enormity of the financial mess left behind by the previous government. Many members offered a variety of views on how the state government could tackle or address budget repair moving forward. Some told us we should stop spending and break our election commitments, while others gave us lists of projects to fund. Sometimes we had conflicting views provided by members of the same political party. Many members used the opportunity to provide their views on a number of policy matters that are under active consideration by government at the moment, and obviously we take those views and those contributions on board, and I'll certainly make sure they're passed on to appropriate ministers. Some members raised the foreign buyers surcharge. Some said it wasn't big enough. Others questioned the impact of it and whether it might be too much. A range of other taxes were addressed, including the gambling tax, including the goods and services tax, and the fact that we do get a raw deal from the feds. A number of members raised the 3,000 voluntary targeted redundancies that have been announced by government, and we'll move through that issue over the next few months. Look, all of the contributions were obviously, well, every member in this place is entitled to make that contribution. I certainly undertake, as the Minister representing the Treasurer in this place, to ensure that a copy of the debate is forwarded to the Treasurer so he can be aware of all the contributions by members of the Legislative Council. And with that, I thank members for their contribution.
Members, we're dealing with Order of the Day 17 Estimates of Revenue and Expenditure Consolidated Account Estimates 2017-2018, where the Minister for the Environment has moved that pursuant to Standing Order number 69, Suborder 1, the Legislative Council take note of table paper number 469A-D 2017-18 budget statements laid upon the table of the House on Thursday, 7 September 2017. And the question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. We now move on to Order of the Day 22, Dangerous Sexual Offenders Legislation. Oh. We now move on to Order of the Day 22, Dangerous Sexual Offenders Legislation Amendment Bill 2017 in second reading, and the question is that the bill be read a second time. The Honourable Michael Mission.
Thank you, Mr Acting President, and I rise as the lead speaker for the Liberal opposition on this bill and indicate that we will be supporting the bill. We shall be doing so not because we consider it will make any meaningful difference to the law, not because it'll make the law any easier to administer, not because it will enhance public safety, not because it'll make any discernible difference to the management of dangerous sexual offenders in the community, but because it will, next time that a dangerous sexual offender is released, leave no scope for Attorney General Quigley and the McGowan government to blame anyone other than themselves, and that they will be exposed to be the frauds that they are. Their approach to this particular vexing problem of what to do with dangerous offenders who have completed their sentences but remain at the end of their sentence a continuing present danger to others in the community if released without supervision has been going for quite some time. And it involves a very delicate balance between a recognition that we do not engage in preventative detention except in extreme circumstances under the principles in which our community is based. There is no question that those that commit harm to others in our community ought to fall under the control of the law and, if necessary, to be imprisoned as a sentence of last resort under the principles of our community, a denial of their liberty. The need for that is several-fold. One is the protection of the community from the depredations of that particular offender. Another factor is one of punishment. Another one is that of general deterrence in order to demonstrate to others the consequences of offending against that particular law in that particular manner. And another one is personal deterrence, to bring home to the offender that if they repeat that sort of behaviour, they will again suffer the consequences, whatever they might be. But it is also a basic principle of democratic societies which have some regard to personal civil liberties, that you do not, as a rule, confine people for what they might do in the future but not already done. Over the last couple of decades, there has been a greater recognition that that principle requires some qualification. There has always been a qualification in those that, because they are not responsible for their actions by way of mental illness or mental disability, but prove to be a danger to others or to be kept under some control, and regrettably sometimes might need to be detained under some security. But over the last several decades, there's been a greater understanding that there are other categories of offenders who may be responsible for their actions and may be beyond rehabilitation or reform, and for whom committing serious crimes is a habit, that they have a proclivity to do so, and that no amount of personal or general deterrence will deter them from, and punishment will deter them from that course. And one of the more notorious categories of offenders, of course, are sexual offenders. In the early 2000s, there was a recognition of that, and legislation, quite pioneering legislation, allowing for an element of preventative detention was passed in Queensland. That legislation was effectively picked up by the Western Australian government of the day, the Attorney General of the day being the Honourable Jim McGuinty, and introduced into Western Australia. And that legislation, the Dangerous Sexual Offenders Act 2004, has been an asset to the manner in which the community manages offenders of a certain category. And there are very good arguments for extending that sort of preventative detention to other cases where there is a clear-cut prospect that a person will continue to reoffend in serious fashion. But the point of the legislation in 2004 was to provide for that very preventative detention against those categories of offenders, and I'll go into that in a little while. What is particularly disturbing is that the legislation, albeit capable of being improved in a variety of ways, and by and large operating in the manner that had been intended when it was passed, came under the criticism of the very party that had passed it. And that was done only for the purposes of political gain. And it is edifying to see the approach that the Australian Labor Party, under the leadership of Mark McGowan, approached this issue. It is typical of a McGowan-led Labor Party over the last few years. They pick an area of public concern, they exploit that concern and public fears, they criticise the government of the day and deride measured efforts to address the issue. They claim that they have a solution. They introduce some half-baked amendments or a member's bill that purports to fix the problem and raise public expectations, knowing that what they propose is either untenable or so flawed that no reasonable government could agree to it, and hoping that the Liberal government of the day will reject it. When those amendments and proposals are duly rejected, They claim that the nasty, heartless Liberals are endangering the public, supporting criminals, and exploit that for what it's worth. They raise expectations with dishonest election commitments. And when in government, they hope the problem will go away. And if it doesn't, they will again blame the Liberals for not having passed the amendments or introduced the measures that they claimed would have fixed the problem in the first place. Then they introduce some amendments. They propose some measures that are a pale imitation of what they had done previously and a pale imitation of what their election commitments were, claim that they are making the toughest laws in Australia, and then lie and dissemble and avoid being held to account for not fulfilling their election commitments. We have seen that on a number of occasions. We have seen that starkly with the misuse of drugs, methamphetamine offences bill that we dealt with earlier this year. It will be recalled, Mr. Acting President, that during the course of the election campaign, and I stress that I understand others may have a different view on mandatory sentencing, and I'm not going into the merits of that. But during the course of the election campaign, the Liberal Party put forward a proposal for mandatory minimum sentences of imprisonment for certain categories of drug trafficker. And because the McGowan-led Labor Party was so anxious to get into office, and because it didn't have any law and justice platform of any value, it fastened onto that. And we had then opposition leader Mark McGowan, now Premier McGowan, saying forthrightly to the media and through the media to the public of Western Australia, yeah, we'll do that too. We'll do that too, he told everyone. And what happened? First chance they get to put their election commitment into action, and do they? No. Instead, they go through this half-baked idea that somehow increasing a maximum sentence from 20-odd years to life is going to make a difference to drug trafficking in this state. Well, we'll see. We'll see. They've got to be careful they don't claim too much credit for that sort of stuff, because although now Attorney General Quigley was tweeting to members of the public back in February, crime is out of control, no one's safe in the community, he's quietened down on that theme since. And the evidence seems to suggest that, in fact, methamphetamine use was declining, albeit a long way to go before it's satisfactory, before this government got into office. I'm sure they'll take credit for it anyway. But that was one example. We have it with the no body, no parole laws, the so-called no body, no parole legislation. Exploit the grief of those who have lost people to murderers and who have not disclosed the whereabouts of the remains. Introduce an amendment in the other place that doesn't even mention no body, no parole. Complain when it has been tweaked in order to actually focus on that issue rather than general comments about police cooperation that were put forward in the then opposition's amendment. Complain that it was, quote, defanged by, close quotes, by a nasty, heartless government. And then earlier this year, introduce a totally different piece of legislation and demand that it be simply accepted at face value. Well, the committee is currently considering that, and we'll see whether it actually meets the public's expectations. We had it last year with a thing called the Asbestos Diseases Compensation Bill, which took up a lot of the time of this place. Arguably the most appallingly badly drafted piece of legislation that's haunted this House. It finally got to a second reading. We agreed to a second reading. Parliament rose. At no stage during any of the debate, notwithstanding submissions on the part of the government that there were problems with the legislation, that it needed to be more carefully considered, that there was scope for some improvement, at no stage were any of those arguments accepted, right up to the death knock. The then opposition, the now government, contended that that legislation was well drafted and would solve the problem, and that there were many asbestos disease victims out there that were depending on its passage and would be disappointed if it wasn't passed. Well, that was last year. This government has been in office since March, and we haven't seen that bill come back, this perfectly drafted piece of legislation. When I asked a question about where it was, I was told, oh, we're looking into it. A lot of work still needs to be done on it. Well, I thought it was perfect. We had members of the other side on their feet in this place telling us it could not be improved on, how essential it was. It needed to be passed in that form. And now, over 6 months later, we still haven't seen it, or anything that looks like it. Where is it? Again, the raising of expectations, the criticism of the government of the day, the putting up of half-baked pieces of legislation, expecting, hoping that it would be rejected in order that the then opposition, the McGowan Labor Party, could take credit for making an effort and blame the other side, and then when it comes to the crunch, are faced with the same difficulties that the then government was faced and have gone quiet on it and hoping that no one will raise the subject. It's not the only one. Limitation periods for child sexual abuse, to be able to sue on that. I recall a bill being introduced in the other place, a private member's bill by one Graham Jacobs MLA. Then opposition wouldn't accept that there needed to be further work on that before a piece of legislation of that gravity could be passed. Claimed that we were protecting child abusers. Ranted and raved about that. Well, where is it? It's drafted. Put it in. You've got the numbers. Why hasn't it been put in? I ask rhetorically. Once again, anything to criticise, never mind principle, never mind public confidence, political advantage will out. That is the whole point of it. Raising people's expectations and then saying, well, actually, it's a little more difficult than what we said it was originally. But any concession that we were correct in any of these cases in not accepting what the ALP had put up, not in the slightest. They haven't got the spine for that. And now we have it with this bill. We tried to hold the McGowan government to its election commitment regarding mandatory minimum sentences for drug traffickers. We tried to improve the no body, no parole proposal last year by the simple expedient of referring it to a committee or supporting its referral to a committee here, and we got criticised by the now Attorney General saying that somehow we were protecting murderers and giving comfort to murderers. Well, we'll see about that. We tried to introduce amendments to this bill before us in the other place to meet the McGowan government's election commitments, and we shall do so again, all in the spirit of assisting the McGowan government to find its way, albeit kicking and screaming and squirming and wriggling and grizzling, to do what it promised to do and what it criticised us for not doing last year, and what it claimed was not only possible but essential and met community expectations. and so there are amendments before this place to do what the McGowan opposition proposed to do last year, and to tighten this bill up, to strengthen it, as was said back then, to meet community expectations, and to do what was possible to make the bill better. And those amendments were rejected in the other place without much explanation. But I'm hoping that the Leader of the House, when she's managing this bill, will be able to assist us further. And hopefully will agree to these amendments and do what they expected us to do last year, what they said in their election manifesto that they would do, and what is within their power now to do. Either that, or she might be able to explain while they were wrong and we were right, and that they made promises that it turns out they cannot keep. I still live in hope that there is such a thing as a conscience on the other side. I'll turn more to the bill in a little while, but I made some comments about the manner in which this legislation has become increasingly the focus of attention, and why it is that, in a sense, this government, now that the McGowan Labor Party is in government, has come to reap the whirlwind that it had sown last couple of years. And this is by no means an exhaustive account of everything that was said, although it is entertaining to go back into some of Hansard and to see the vapourings of the now Attorney General when he gets into full flight and loses all sense of proportion and reality and has to resort to personal abuse to get his message across, whether it's against members of the government or public servants or whoever he feels stands in the way. But let's go back, for example, the Sunday Times of the 19th of August 2012, page 15. And it was an article about cutting the sex drive of what was described as almost half of the state's most notorious rapists and pedophiles, under the heading of "Cut Sex Drive or It's Jail." And there was a comment then from the then Shadow Attorney General John Quigley, who said, "It should be mandatory for dangerous repeat sex offenders to undergo chemical castration before being released. Quote, without this, the danger to our children far outweighs any consideration or concerns of the offenders," he said. I can't say that that was the start of this little campaign, but certainly I would be interested as to what other measures the government is taking in this regard. Now that he has the ability to do so, is now Attorney General John Quigley making it mandatory for dangerous repeat sex offenders to undergo chemical castration before being released? And if not, why not? Or is it another piece of puffery to take advantage of public concern, to get himself a headline without any real thought behind it, without really any intention of fulfilling it, but just to have a bit of a go? No doubt the Leader of the House will be able to help us out there, as I'm sure there have been great discussions about this very important area of public policy and the safety of the community. It's certainly exercised the minds and efforts of the then Labor Party opposition for something like 4 years. Surely they haven't forgotten that. Is there anything in the legislation that's being proposed to require chemical castration of pedophiles or sex offenders? Why not? Or was John Quigley lying? Was he making it up at the time? Can't believe that. There's bound to be a good explanation why that hasn't been covered by this legislation. Very important to the public safety. One that needs to be passed very urgently. That was a couple of months ago, of course. It's been sitting on the notice paper since. But anyway, I'd like the Leader of the House to explain what's happening in that regard about mandatory protections such as chemical castration. Can't be because it may be contrary to United Nations conventions or any other civil libertarian consideration, because, and I'll come to some of the quotes, it was quite patent in the debate and the comments of the now Attorney-General in the other place that those considerations ought to be set aside for public safety. We'll see whether he was a hypocrite, a liar, a hypocrite then, or a hypocrite now, or simply lying, or whether he's got a propensity just to say whatever he likes.
You didn't accuse him of that.
I gave an option. I'm prepared to accept and give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's dishonest and incompetent. But perhaps there is another explanation, Leader of the House, for why he says one thing and then when he actually gets into a position of responsibility that he's been seeking for the last, 8 years? I think it's been longer than that. I wouldn't trust him any earlier than that. I think he's been there since the McGuinty days. Mind you, on that subject, I didn't hear him complaining about the release of dangerous sex offenders back in the days post the Dangerous Sexual Offenders Act being passed in 2004. And yet it was during that period of time that a number of them were released. And in fact, at that time, the Labor Party didn't seem to have a problem with the way that the legislation was working, didn't think it was flawed, didn't think that it was inadequate. Perhaps the Leader of the House will be able to explain why their attitude has changed. 19th of March 2014, and this is on the back of a dangerous sexual offender being released under the Act. And again, I can't comment because I haven't gone back to all the material, but I think it outlines the level of the debate that was being engaged in, and this time by the Leader of the then opposition, the now Premier McGowan. Again, someone who is in a position of responsibility and capable of doing what the rhetoric suggested ought to have been done under our watch. And he says, in the course of a radio interview with one Gary Adshead, who was very vocal about the risks to the community back in that time, although he's quietened down since the Labor Party got into government. I don't know why that is, but he seems to have lost interest in dangerous sex offenders since then. But he was talking to then Labor opposition leader Mark McGowan, and asked him, OK, let's start with, you probably just followed before the news, we were talking about this man who has been released into the community on a supervision order. Now, he is a man who has raped 2 women, sexually attacked in some way, shape or form, 13 women all up. His record is deplorable. Even when he was released on a supervision order in 2012, he breached it within weeks and went back in the slammer, came up for review, now he's released again. Even the Attorney-General, Mr McGowan, seemed very frustrated by this. What do you think about it? Well, personally I'm outraged. I think any right-thinking person is outraged. It's only a matter of time, I expect, before this person offends again. I find it perhaps quaint that the Attorney-General's upset about it, but the question is, why didn't the Attorney-General do something about it? Well, there's been a couple of dangerous sex offenders that have been released under this government's watch, and I asked the Leader of the House, and perhaps she'll assist us, why didn't the Attorney-General do something about it? What could the Attorney-General have done, I asked rhetorically. Well, Mark McGowan had the answers. Facts were at his fingertips. He said, the Attorney-General can speak to the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Director of Public Prosecutions did not oppose the release of this prisoner. If the Attorney-General had spoken to him or had words with him about their approach on this, well, the outcome may well have been different. Adshead then goes on saying, well, you're saying that you've got to remain independent of the judiciary in terms of how it does its job. You're right in terms of the DPP did not oppose, in fact put forward some submissions under this 10-year supervision order. This person could be released in the community, hopefully safely. You're saying that he could have expressed concerns that the DPP were going to go down that path and support it. Well, says Mark McGowan, the DPP isn't the judiciary, got that bit right. The DPP is an independent statutory office holder appointed by the government. Got that bit right. Independent seems to have a flexible meaning for this government, but we'll get to that in a moment. If I was the Attorney-General, he goes on to say, and I knew this was coming on, I would have had words with the DPP about the approach the DPP took. I don't think that is inappropriate, and I think it's a gross failure and a gross negligence on the part of the Attorney-General not to have done so. Well, I now interpose and say, well, there's a thing called the Director of Public Prosecutions Act. That was passed by a Labor government. That was passed to establish an independent statutory office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. It also had in it a provision that said that the Attorney-General of the day can direct the Director of Public Prosecutions on general matters, on policy, but not on individual cases. That if the Attorney-General does direct the Director, or instruct the Director on individual cases, the Director is obliged to report that in the annual report. I don't think that has ever been done because Attorneys-General have tended, at least up until now, to be conscious of their responsibilities, not to interfere politically with independent statutory office holders. I see that Premier Mark McGowan may have a different idea of how that ought to operate, and certainly would seem open to his current Attorney-General to follow the instructions and the guidance of the current Premier, and I look forward to the next annual report to see how many times Attorney-General Quigley has words with the DPP about the approach the DPP should take in individual cases. He then went on and talked about toughness on crime. He goes on to say, I'm saying the Attorney-General should have spoken to the DPP about the approach the DPP took, so there can't be any doubt as to what he has in mind. Premier McGowan is of the view that a proper DPP ought to be calling up, a proper Attorney-General ought to be calling up the Director of Public Prosecutions and telling him what to do. He then goes to opine about other bits about the legislation and claims that the only reason this man was able to be released is because Joe Francis, the Minister for Corrective Services, has allowed for this bracelet system by which a bracelet can be put around the offender's ankle. Therefore, they can be released into the community. Had this bracelet system not been in place or not been available for dangerous repeat sex offenders, I expect the judge would have said this man should stay in prison. Well, that's pretty interesting. No doubt the Leader of the House will explain to us why. Well, firstly, if the GPS tracking system is still in place, given the risks posed by it, to have dangerous sex offenders released into the community that otherwise would not be, and what the government is doing to stop that from happening. I again digress for a moment to point out that last year, when we were moving amendments to this legislation through this place, there were a number of amendments proposed by the then opposition, one of which included directing courts that they were not to take into account the availability of global positioning systems or other tracking devices when considering whether to release an offender on a supervision order. I don't see anything like that in the current legislation. I'm a bit disappointed. I thought that that was pushed very ardently back then. It seems to have disappeared, and I don't know why that isn't being done as an additional safeguard by this government that is so concerned about this issue and thought it was worthwhile raising back then. And perhaps the Leader of the House will take the opportunity to make good what they were frustrated in doing last year and meeting the expectations that were being raised, or that they had raised anyway. Mark McGowan went on to say that if it were not for this bracelet around his ankle, I expect the judge would not have released him. If the DPP had objected, the Director of Public Prosecutions had objected, I expect the judge would not have released him. But the judge acted on the advice of the DPP, and he used a system brought in by Mr Barnett's government. This is a monumental failure that I think is not protecting the community adequately from a dangerous sex offender. ADZ says, all right, would you guys take it up in the Parliament? And McGowan says, oh, I expect we will. I mean, most people are outraged by this sort of thing, but especially when you can see failures by government. As I say, we've seen numerous failures by a government that talks tough on crime, but action is sparse. Well, I invite the Leader of the House to take it up in Parliament on behalf of the now Premier and introduce measures that will require judges not to take into account GPS tracking as a factor, and to explain to us why it is that the current Attorney-General has not told the DPP what action to take in these cases. Digress for a moment to find another very interesting element in this transcript. Talking about renewable energy as it matters, and Mark McGowan made the classic comment, it was an outrageous thing to go and rip up contracts with citizens of the state, which is what the state government did, and then they backtracked on it. People who signed up for these contracts signed up in good faith, they invested money on the back of it. It was a shocking example of what a state would try to do, and I'm glad they were forced out of it. That's to do with renewable energy, but it's quaint from a Premier who came into office saying he's going to tear up contracts. But getting back to dangerous sex offenders for a moment, while there is still time before we have to break for the next stage of proceedings. And this is comment from the then Shadow Attorney-General about how matters ought to be dealt with. And the breach of orders under a supervision order, and question of whether someone ought to be released on bail pending determination of that breach. And the then Shadow Attorney-General told us that the way it ought to be done is that the police need to be told by the Minister of the day to bring on applications to revoke bail. Now, what appears to have happened is the offender was arrested or summoned, brought before a court,